In John chapter 9, if I titled a message today, the title would simply be What I Know. But in John chapter 9, we have one of the greatest I know statements, I think, anywhere in the New Testament. Has anybody ever made an I know statement? Haven't we all made it? You say, I know this. I know. Trust me, I know. I think we have all made those kind of statements. We've made them to our friends. We've made them to our spouses. We've made them to coworkers, classmates. We've even made them to God, haven't we? I know. I know this. Last week we were in John chapter 6, and we talked about how Jesus had fed the 5,000 men plus women and children with 5 loaves and 2 fish. It was a miracle of miracles, which is one of the reasons why all 4 Gospels talk about the story. But Jesus had asked Philip where we could buy food to feed all of these people. And Philip told Jesus that even if they worked for months, it couldn't be done. Andrew, who had the young boy's sack lunch in hand, looked at how little it was, and he basically told Jesus the very same thing. It can't be done. But where Philip magnified the crowd and lessened God, and Andrew minimized what was in his hands and lessened God, this little boy, we talked about it last week, he had enough faith to place what he had in Jesus' hands, and what he transferred, Jesus transformed, and he fed everyone until they were full, and they ended up having 12 baskets left over to share. Again, it was a miracle of miracles. But you read on down at the end of that chapter number 6, you find Jesus crossing again to the other side of the lake, and the crowds following him, and you discover that they followed him not because of who he claimed to be, but because he fed them. John chapter 6, verse 26. And Jesus tells them in verse 35, he tells them and he says, I am the bread of life. Now, many who were in that crowd that day had been with Jesus on the other side of the lake, and they had eaten the bread until they were full with leftovers to spare, but they did not understand that what Jesus was doing was a physical demonstration of a spiritual truth. That when we come to Jesus and we partake of what he has to give us spiritually, he will feed our soul and nourish us to a way that we'll always have plenty to spare. He will fill us to the overflow. But those listening, they didn't get it. Jesus was giving them an illustrated message concerning himself, but they only saw it as a free lunch. So when Jesus started talking about how he was the living bread, John 6:51, and how if anyone was to eat this bread, they will live forever, and this bread which I offer is going to, that they may live as my flesh, it offended them. They were offended by it. They could not grasp what Jesus was saying, and they couldn't understand the underlying meaning of the miracle, the feeding of the 5 loaves and 2 fish, so they were offended by Jesus. Think about that. They were offended by Jesus. It's hard to grasp that, isn't it? How could Jesus offend? I mean, Jesus is the embodiment of love, right? He's the embodiment of joy and peace. He only went about doing good, and yet they were offended by him. Can I ask a question very rhetorically, because I don't want you to look at somebody? Has anybody ever been offended? Sure we have. We've all have. I've been offended. I've offended. Not purposefully, but it's happened, and it's the same for all of you. You've been offended, and you've offended. It happens. In fact, I offended my wife, Debbie, the other night in her dream. It's true, and some of you guys, maybe you can relate to this. She got up the other morning, and I was having my coffee like I always do, and the next thing I know, she's telling me how upset and angry that she is because of the way I had treated her in her dream. It's the comic strip of the guy who's buying flowers once again to make up for whatever he had done in his wife's dream. But Debbie was offended in her dream by the way I had treated her. She told me that we were on a plane flying somewhere, and I had got up and moved to a seat closer to the front because I didn't want to be so far in the back, but I left her back there by herself, and I didn't seem to care. She said that in her dream that she needed some help with the in-flight entertainment center, and I told her that she could just figure it out. And she was upset. And to make matters worse, when we landed and Matthew picked us up in her dream, she tells him all about it because she's wanting him to take her side. And Matthew looks at his mom and says, "What's the big deal?" So she walks in, and she's offended. I'm so upset at you. I think, what did I do? It's not me. That's Dream Larry. It's not me. Some of you guys will get that. We've all been offended, and we all have offended, even in our dreams. But think about to be offended by Jesus. It sounds illogical. It sounds unreal because he's the good shepherd. He's the Lamb of God. He's the one who went about healing the sick and comforting the hurting and restoring the broken. And yet here's a group of people who are being offended by him. And why were they offended? It's because he called them out for their true motivation for wanting to be with him. In other words, they only wanted Jesus for what they could get out of him, not for who he was. And when he told them who he was, that offended them too, because for them, he was nothing more than the son of Joseph, not the son of God. And when he pressed them to believe and to commit and to follow him, verse 66, it says, many of his disciples turned away and they deserted him. They basically said, I'm through with you. I'm offended by you. I'm not going to walk with you any longer. See, that's how it ends. Basically, with the crowds, many of his disciples abandoning him, his 12 disciples remaining. As Peter said in verse 68, but Lord, whom shall we go to? Only you have the words to give eternal life. That's how John 6 ends. And then John 7 and 8, we find Jesus going to the Jerusalem, speaking at the temple. There he makes several more I am statements concerning himself. In John 7, he declares himself to be the living water, verses 37 and 38. In John 8, he says he's the light of the world, verse 12, and he's the great I am, verse 58. And this time the Jews are not just offended by him, they want to stone him. Why? Because Jesus is making a declaration of deity about himself, so they pick up stones to throw at him. But verse 59 of John 8 says that he was hidden from them and he left the temple. That's what's happening and has happened as we flow into chapter number 9. Which begins by saying this. I hope you're there. As Jesus was walking along, what's happened? He's just left the temple. They're going to stone him. They pick up stones to throw at him. He's just left. He slipped. He was hidden from their ears. He's just left. So as he's walking along, walked away from there, walking towards one of the city gates, he saw a man who had been blind from birth. And obviously he had to point him out to the disciples because his disciples asked him, Rabbi, why was this man born blind? Was it because of his own sins or his parents' sins? Listen, the teaching of that day was that people's lot in life was the result of something they had done. It was something they had done that was wrong. Their blindness, their barrenness, their deafness, their lameness, their leprosy condition, their financial calamity, whatever it was, for them it was God's punishment for some sin that they must have committed. Do you remember Job's friend? They basically determined that all of his suffering was because of some evil deed, some sin that he must have committed. So they made this assumption based upon what they saw. His children had died. His financial estate was in ruin. He was sitting in boils. Therefore, they concluded that Job was being punished for the sin he obviously had committed, knowingly or unknowingly. We know that's not the case because we read the story. But those that were there, that's what they believed. And sometimes we still do that today. It's true, don't we? There's a lot of people today that look at what's happening in somebody's life and they say, aha, they must have done something wrong. They must have committed a sin. Can our sins lead to calamities and suffering in our bodies, our minds, our families, our marriages, our finances? Absolutely they can. Why? Because there's a principle of sowing and reaping. We reap what we sow. If we sow to the flesh, we're going to reap the consequences of it. Just as we sow to the Spirit, we'll reap the consequences of the Spirit. But you can't just assume when somebody's facing something or going through something that is a punishment from God. You can't just look and say, okay, obviously they've done something wrong. That's why this is happening. Just as you cannot assume that those who are healthy and wealthy are blessed of God because of something righteous that they have done, right? Listen, the disciples grew up in a Jewish culture that taught that if something was wrong, it was because God was punishing them for something they had done, a sin. In fact, they literally had a saying that went like this: there is no death without sin, and there is no suffering without iniquity. And when they saw this guy who had been blind since birth, they asked Jesus the question, Rabbi, why was this man born blind? Was it because of his own sins or his parents' sins? They just assumed that somebody obviously must have sinned. How a baby sins in the womb is beyond me, but that was part of the question. Who sinned? Did he sin in his mother's womb because he was born blind, or is it the result of his parents' sins? And Jesus answered, verse 3, it was not because of his sins or his parents' sins. This happened so the power of God could be seen in him. In other words, this wasn't the result of anybody's sins. It was simply the result of a fallen world that is broken because of sin. But now Jesus was here to change all of that. Aren't you glad that Jesus is here to change some stuff? In other words, because Jesus was now in the midst, because Jesus had now entered into our world, his power to overcome any sickness or pain or problem or sin was going to be displayed through this blind man. Listen, I don't know what anybody here maybe or may not be walking through. I know this. Life has a way of hitting us all in the face time to time. Somebody said it like this, talking about every person. Every person's life is summed up like this. We're either walking through a trial, have just come out of a trial, or about to walk into a trial. But no matter where we may be walking, if Jesus lives in us, we can take heart. Because he has overcome the world, we can overcome the world. Whatever we're walking through, whatever it may be today, God, I believe, would like to use it as an opportunity to show himself mighty and strong on our behalf so that we might see the power of God working in us and for us. I know this. If the disciples had not been rowing and struggling in the storm, they would have never known that Jesus had the power to speak the word and stop it. All I'm saying is that in the storms that God reveals himself the most to us. Some of us are saying today, probably, God, I know who you are, stop it. But it's a reality. We see God most poignantly in the storm. C.S. Lewis said this. He says, pain insists upon being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but he shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. Listen, Jesus told his disciples that this man's blindness wasn't because of his sins or his parents' sins, but it was so the power of God could be seen in him. And then Jesus does the most unsanitary thing imaginable. Verse 6 and 7 says that he spit on the ground, made some mud with his saliva, and then he spread the mud over the blind man's eyes and told him, go and wash himself in the pool of Siloam. It's probably a good thing the guy was blind. You know what I'm saying? Think about it. I mean, typically when Jesus healed the sick, he laid his hands on them, right? Or he just spoke the word. That was it. He never spit. But this time he did, and you're like, what is gotten into Jesus? I know this. Today, if somebody was to spit on something, or spit on you, it's like, let's get it on. It's fight time. You know what I'm saying? Lawsuit time, some kind of time. When we pray for people down here at the front, we follow Mark 16 where Jesus said that we're to lay our hands on the sick and they shall recover. There are times when we'll anoint with oil and pray like it says in James 5:14. We don't spit. Somebody say, thank God, we don't spit. We're not a spitting church. I mean, I spit when I preach, so stay back. I'll be honest with you. If I was coming down to be prayed for and somebody says, God just told me that I need to spit on my fingers, spit on something, I'd be like, okay, I'll wait for the next guy. Am I right? Can we be honest? It's probably a good thing that this guy was blind because he couldn't see what Jesus was doing. But here's the thing about Jesus spitting and making mud. Some people believe, some scholars believe that this man wasn't just blind in the sense that his eyes were clouded over to the point of not seeing since birth, but rather he was blind because his eyes had never formed. In other words, nothing had developed within his eye sockets themselves. They were like two sunken holes with skin covering them. Did you know it's actually a medical condition that one baby out of every 5,400 can be born with this? And it's called, and I'm probably going to mess this up, so all of our doctors, Dr. Terry and everybody, it's called anophthalmia. Dr. Terry will have to help me on that. The point is that some believe that Jesus, just as he did in the beginning when he formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed his breath into his nostrils, Genesis 2:7, that Jesus spit into the dust, and in his omnipotent power as creator God, He formed two eyes and he placed them in their sockets. Think about it. Jesus didn't spit. He spit in the mud. He made some mud. Go wash in the pool of Siloam. And somebody had to help him find it. But when he went and washed, just as Jesus said, he came back running on his own, seeing. Listen, last week we talked about Jesus feeding the 20 to 25,000 with 5 loaves and 2 fish with leftover to spare. This week is about Jesus spitting and making mud as creator God so that the power of God could be seen in him. Again, somebody needs to grab this today. God's not limited by the size of our problems. Physically, financially, emotionally, relationally, spiritually. He taken a little and transform it into something more, or he could just create something out of nothing. Why? Because that's who God is. See, John 9 begins by saying, as Jesus is walking along, he saw a man who had been born blind from birth. His disciples asked, Rabbi, why was this man born blind? Was it because of his own sins or his parents' sins? And Jesus answered, it was not because of his or his parents' sins. This happened so that the power of God could be seen in him. And so he spit on the ground, verse 6, made mud with his saliva, and he spread the mud over the blind man's eyes. He told him, go wash yourself in the pool of Siloam. So the man went and washed, and he came back seeing. And I love this because his neighbors, verse 8, and others who knew him as the blind beggar, they knew him as sitting there, this blind man with no eyeballs in his eyes, sunken holes, skin covering. They asked each other, isn't this the man who used to sit and beg? Because you can only imagine he's coming back, he's got eyes. And he's looking at everything, looking at you. Some said he was, and others said, no, he just looked like him. But the beggar kept saying, yes, I'm the same one. Yes, it's really me. It's me. And they asked, who healed you? What happened? And he told them the man they called Jesus. He made mud and he spread it over my eyes, and he told me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash yourself. So I went and washed, and now I can see. And they asked, where is he now? And he says, I don't know. So they took the man who had been blind to the Pharisees because it was the Sabbath that Jesus had made the mud and healed him. I don't know who these neighbors were. I don't know who these others were. And I don't know whether or not they took him to the Pharisees because he'd been healed on the Sabbath or because he'd been healed, period. And they just wanted to see if there's about one way or another. He's now standing in front of the Pharisees. And don't you know he's excited? He's got eyes. He can see. He's excited. Oh, you're the Pharisees. Okay. And the Pharisees asked the man about it. So he told them, verse 15, he put mud over my eyes. And when I washed it away, I could see. Told them it was Jesus. Next thing you know, these guys are arguing themselves about who Jesus is. Verse 16, some of the Pharisees says, this man Jesus is not from God. Why? Because he's working on the Sabbath. I mean, who does that? Others says, but how could be an ordinary sinner do such miraculous signs? So there was deep division amongst them. Listen, one of the biggest problems that the Pharisees had with Jesus was the fact that he did not observe their Sabbath rules the way they wanted him to. Remember in John 5, we mentioned it last week, when Jesus healed the man by the pool of Siloam, by the pool of Bethesda, who had been lame for 38 years on the Sabbath. The Pharisees looked at it as breaking of God's law, and so they began to harass him. Instead of rejoicing over the fact that this guy was now walking for the first time in 38 years, they were mad because Jesus dared to heal somebody on their precious day. Listen, the Pharisees thought Jesus was a sinner at worst and an instigator of division at best. For a lot of them, his healing on the Sabbath was his undermining of their authority. His healing on the Sabbath was his way of breaking the law of Moses. They didn't care about the healing. They cared about the fact that he did it. So they asked this man who had been blind from birth but was now seeing, who healed you? And he tells them everything he had told his neighbors. The man they called Jesus made mud and spread it over my eyes and told me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash yourself. So I went and washed, and now I can see. And when they asked him, well, so what do you think about this man, Jesus? Oh, that's just a silly question, right? The guy just heals your eyes. So what do you think about Jesus? And he tells me, I think he must be a prophet. And they get so furious, they go ballistic over it. So they bring the guy's parents in to interrogate him. He had to be somewhere in his teens, anywhere from probably 13 to 17, just a young man. So they bring his parents in to interrogate them. They ask them, is this your son? Was he born blind? If so, how is it now that he can see? And his parents replied, we know this is our son and that he was born blind, but we don't know how he can see or healed him. Ask him. He's old enough to speak for himself. What's happening here is that they're trying to recuse themselves so they won't get kicked out of the synagogue, which for the Jews was their equivalency of being excommunicated. So they said, he's a big boy now. He can talk. He can actually see you now. Talk to him. He can speak for himself. And so for the second time, verse 24, they called in the man who had been blind. They told him, God should get the glory for this because we know this man, Jesus, is a sinner. And I love this guy's response, and this is that I know statement. He simply said this, I don't know whether he is a sinner, but I know this. I know this. This is what I know. I was blind, but now I can see. I know this, that when Jesus lays his hand upon somebody, he changes them. I know this. Think about John Newton, who wrote that great Christian hymn, Amazing Grace. He was just a boy when he became a sailor on his father's ship. As he grew up, he became a man who indulged in every type of sin and debauchery imagining, to the point that he even participated in the capturing of West Africans and taking them to the West Indies to be sold as slaves. He was so cold and callous towards humanity that selling another human being didn't seem to bother him no matter how horrific it was. As time went by, he worked his way up to becoming a captain of his own slave ship. But one day, many years later, in 1748, while voyaging from Africa to England, a storm arose that was so furious that fear gripped him. He was so afraid that his ship might capsize that he went into his cabin, unable to control the situation, and began to search for a book to take the fear away from him. He picked up Thomas Kempis's classic Christian devotional, The Imitation of Christ, and he began to read it. And when the storm ceased and they had all survived, it made an impact on him. And yet he continued to serve as a captain of a slave ship for several more years. He tried to justify what he did by improving the conditions of the ship. He tried to justify it by offering religious services for his crew, but over time, he finally came to realize that there was nothing he could do to justify what was so clearly abhorrent to God. So he repented. He left the slave trade. He became an ordained minister, a songwriter, and a powerful abolitionist. In fact, it was his influence and friendship with William Wilberforce that eventually led to the end of slavery throughout all the United Kingdom. But where he's not always remembered for his work to end slavery, he is remembered for this song that represented his own testimony of grace when God laid his hands on him. And he said this, amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. I was blind, but now I can see. Friends, that was the testimony of this blind man who'd been born that way from birth. He told the Pharisees, I don't know if Jesus is a sinner, but I know this. I was once blind. I was once living in darkness, but now I can see. But that's not enough for them, right? So they ask him, but what did he do? How did he heal you? And I love you can hear this. This is a teenager in him right here. He said, look, I told you once. Didn't you listen to what I was saying? I got to say this again. He says, why do you want to hear it again? I love it. Do you want to become his disciples too? And they cursed him. fact, verse 34 says they threw him out of the synagogue. Get it. What they're doing, they're excommunicating him. But I love this. Verse 35, because when Jesus heard what had happened, he found the man and asked, do you believe in the Son of Man? The man answered, who is he, sir? I want to believe in him. Jesus says, you have seen him. He's the one speaking to you right now. The one that had put the mud on your eyes. You're now seeing him. And the man says, yes, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped Jesus. The religious looked at this young man who had been healed, and instead of rejoicing, declared that Jesus was a sinner. To which this young man replied, in the midst of social pressure, in the midst of enormous intimidation, the possibility of excommunication, he said, I don't know about what you're saying. I only know what I know. And this is what I know. I was blind. Now I see. Do you have some knowings about Jesus today? Come on, I'm asking a question. Do you have some knowings about who Jesus is today in your life? Here's some of mine. I know he's my salvation. I know he's my healer. I know he's my provider. I know he's my intercessor, my great high priest, and my soon-coming king. I know that he's my defense and my defender. I know he's my refuge and strength, a very present help in time of trouble. I know he's my strong high tower whom I can run to and be safe. I know he is for me and not against me. I know that because of him I can be strong. I can have courage and not be afraid. I know that because of him all things will work together for my good, and I can do all things through Christ who gives me the strength. I know that ultimately that by him and in him and through him I will overcome, for greater is he that is in me than he that is in the world. Do you have some knows today about Jesus? That's all I'm asking. Do you have some knowings about Jesus? You need to write them down. You need to take your journal, your tablet. You need to write what you know about Jesus, who Jesus is in your life. I know this. Who is Jesus to you? Listen, where the masses failed to receive Jesus and the Pharisees failed to accept Jesus, this young blind man had a life-changing encounter. And it was more than the physical blindness, it was the spiritual blindness. And he could say both physically and spiritually, I know this. I was once blind, but now I can see. When you have a genuine encounter with the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, when you have a genuine encounter with him, you cannot come away without having some knowings about who he is. Because Jesus would change your life forever. A few weeks back, I was watching Redeem TV. And by the way, Redeem TV is a free app that you can download on a Fire TV, Apple TV. It's free, nothing but Christian content. Redeem TV. It's free. Incredible. But they had a documentary, and I was watching it, entitled Lusaka, which is a Quechua word for hunter or seeker in the country of Zimbabwe. The documentary was about a man by the name of Basil O'Connell Jones. He was a thrill seeker who grew up in Rhodesia, today it's Zimbabwe. During the hippie movement, he got started out on drugs and alcohol. Consumed him as a teen. He moved to London for a time where he became more involved with using and selling drugs. But when most of his friends had been arrested and locked up, he went back home to Rhodesia, and he ended up joining the army, where he was assigned to Rhodesia's Light Infantry Unit, which was basically their special ops unit fighting against terrorism. He did that for 2 years. But on February the 1st, 1977, and let me just say, he was a man who had no experience with God. But on February the 1st, 1977, he and his unit were ambushed, and Beza was shot through the head, a bullet going through both sides of his brain with an AK-47 rifle, and he died. The other men in his unit took a pulse, he was dead. They pulled back, they called in artillery to come in to help alleviate what was happening. 28 minutes later, Beza woke up. He said that within those 28 minutes, he felt his soul leaving his body and experiencing his entire life flash before him. He was evacuated by helicopter and hospitalized for more than a year. He was told he would probably never walk, talk, write, maybe never even see again. For him, it was a time of extreme frustration and anger and depression. He wrestled with his experience with death, trying to explain it away, but it was too real. He knew he had died. He spent the next 18 months searching for answers in all sorts of avenues because he knew he was going to die again one day. He just wanted to know where and how and who had the answers to his life. He said that it was in this time of searching he found himself in a rehabilitation center for Army guys who had been injured during the war. He said they were casually talking one afternoon about their different experiences and injuries, and he told about how he had died and was looking for somebody to answer the questions about life after death. And there just so happened to be a Christian medic listening to the conversation who would later come and sit in front of him at dinner and have a conversation. He said they spoke for a couple of hours about Jesus, about salvation, about sin, about life after death, and so many things. He said that that night, as they took him back to his room and he laid on his bed, he said he was a broken man. And he looked up towards heaven and he says, Jesus, if you're real, please forgive me and save my soul from sin. He said he fell into a beautiful sleep, and the next morning when he woke up, he knew he was a new creation. He said he knew everything was different. He said for the first time in his entire life, he had peace and joy in his heart, and he knew he had been truly born again. He learned to walk again, though it was a struggle and he needed help. He learned to talk again. Most importantly, he learned to live again. He got married, had 2 children, and he became a minister of the gospel, a pastor and a preacher, and he's been sharing Jesus now for over 45 years. In fact, he went on to write his own book entitled Amazing Grace because he had had a real encounter with Jesus, who had laid his hands upon him. For once he was lost, now he was found. Once he was blind, but now he could see. What do you know about Jesus today? When I ask that, I'm not asking what you can tell me about him, about his life, his miracles, the stories, the parables. I want you, what do you know about Jesus in your life? I don't want you to tell me what you know about him in the facts. I want you to know about the knowing, that place of intimacy in your heart. You know him. How do you know Jesus today? How do you know him? What are the I knows in your life concerning Jesus? Do you know him as Savior? Do you know him as healer? Do you know him as provider? Do you know him as your king? Do you know him as the Redeemer? Do you know him as the one who gives you strength? The one that gives you help, the one that gives you peace, the one that gives you courage, the one that helps you to walk through stuff. Do you know him that way? How do you know him today? I think sometimes in church we can be caught up in all that we know about him from the factual side. I know who he is, but I want to know, how do you know him? Who is Jesus in your life? It's one of the greatest I know statements in the New Testament. Jesus, Who sinned? His parents or him? It's neither one. You're going to see the power of God because of him. Sin's in the world, but I've come to break the power of sin. He spits in the ground, makes some mud, places it on his eyes. Go and wash. Comes back singing, rejoicing, celebration, excitement. Neighbors and friends say, that can't be him. No, it's me. They take him to the Pharisees. Who did this? Jesus did it. What do you think about Jesus? I think he's a prophet. Kick him out. Call his parents in. Is this your son? It is. How's he seeing? Ask him. He's a big boy. They bring him back in again. What happened? I've already told you this. Are you telling me that you believe in Jesus? This man who is a sinner. Why is he a sinner? Because he healed on the Sabbath. That's why. I don't know if he's a sinner or not, but I know this. After Jesus laid his hands on me, this is how it was before Jesus. This is how it was after Jesus. I know this. I was blind, but now I see. Do y'all want to be his disciples? To get out of here. And Jesus comes and finds him. Do you know who the Son of Man is? No, sir. It's the one you're seeing. You're seeing. I believe. And he worshiped him. And his life was never the same. Because he had a real knowing about Jesus. Do you know him? How do you know him? Has that resonated in you? Again, I don't know what everybody's walking through today. Some of us need to better have a knowing. Because when life smacks us in the face, like I said, our life is summed up in three ways. We're either in a trial, just come out of a trial, or about to walk into a trial. And we better have a knowing about who he is. Do you know Jesus? Stand together. Hallelujah. There's nobody like Jesus. There's nobody like Jesus. I know this, on the last day when we stand before the Lord, when God judges humanity, we're going to be asked, do you know him? Do you know him? And what he's looking for is not an intellectual answer. He's not looking for you to give an answer. Yeah, I know who Jesus is. He's looking for a knowing that's relational. Oh yeah, I know Jesus. Tommy Barnett, who pastored there in Phoenix, Arizona for many, many years, he used to say, I've heard him preach, I heard him say it personally. You know, he said he'd talk about, different athletes and different people. He says, oh, I know them. They're my best buddies. He didn't really know them, but he knew about them. I know them. Remember old Bo, was running back? Bo Jackson, yeah, thank you. He had that commercial back in the day, Bo Knows. Bo knows every sport, Bo knows. He's just good. He's just awesome. We can know things and not know him. I want to know Jesus. I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection. If you're walking through a valley today, you need to know that Jesus is a friend that sticketh closer than a brother. You need to know that he promised he would never leave you nor forsake you. If you're being attacked and assailed on every side at your job, at work, wherever, at school, in life, you need to know that God is for you and not against you. That he is your defense. He is your defender. If you're battling sickness and disease and a diagnosis, you need to know that he is your healer. Do you know him? Some of us need to have another talk with Jesus. We need to have him lay his hands on us again. We need to have that encounter with him. We need to have some time with him so we can have that knowing in us. Whatever it is, I was blind, but now I see. He laid his hands on me. I don't know how to do this altar here tonight. I'm serious. I don't know how to do it. I want to do this, simply this. I want us to get along with God, to come and stand, come and kneel. We've got a few minutes before Bible study. You guys ought to be just jumping for joy 2 weeks in a row to find a place and get with God and say, God, I just need to have a knowing today. I don't know what you're walking, but I just need to have a knowing. I just need to have a knowing. Can we do that right now? Less me, more you. Less my talking, more you praying. Can we do that right now? Can we just come and just say, God, I want to know you right now in this. I just want to know you better right now, what I'm walking through. I just want to know you right now with this that's going on, whatever it is, in my family, in my marriage, in my kids. I just need to know you.